Hello, my name is Roisin and I'm going to talk to you about 10 literary fiction books that I have read since the start of this channel that I love. I have made 2 videos before about literary fiction books that I love, one in 2020 and one in 2021, so I'll leave them linked in the cards above, but I thought it was time to do an updated version. I've read many books since then, my taste has changed slightly. I'm also completely eschewing historical fiction in this video. Some of them are a little bit historical, but only like late 20th century to early 21st century, so not very historical at all. Like, there's a debate whether you could call them historical novels. But if historical fiction is what you're interested in, I have loads of videos about that, so I'll leave a playlist in the cards above as well. But let's get into the books. The first one on my list is Unburied by Zadie Smith, which is a book I read earlier this year. I have a review of it on my channel. If you'd like to go and check it out, it will be linked up there as well. And Unburied is an adaptation of Howard's End by E.M. Forster, but set in the early 21st century in a university setting. We follow Howard and his family. Howard is a British art professor who's working in an Ivy League campus in the American Northeast. And he is married to a black Floridian woman who works in a hospital. And their mixed-race children grew up initially in London, but now live in the States. And the novel begins with the eldest, Jerome, visiting in London, the patriarch of which is Howard's sworn enemy, a conservative art historian who ends up, through the novel, working at the same university as Howard. It is a novel with a lot of setup, but not a lot of plot in terms of what actually happens. We just follow these different characters, the 5 Belsies and also the other family, as they interact with one another. It looks at ivory towers, ideas of identity, class, race and gender, what it means to love and to be in love. It contains within it both coming of age stories and middle-aged meltdown stories. It is really a character-focused book, and I think that the characters are incredibly well developed. All of them are very flawed, all of them can be unlikable at times, but also I think most of them can be quite endearing as well. Zadie Smith is really a master of conjuring a scene, and so making it very visual but also very realistic, to the point of discomfort sometimes with the behaviour of our characters. Particularly, I think this book has one of the most uncomfortable sex scenes I have ever read, but definitely on purpose. I just love her writing. She has that kind of dry, witty, slightly detached feeling that is familiar from an Edwardian novel like Forster that she is adapting, but also has a modern sensibility and modern ideas. She lets her characters kind of go where they will, and so it feels true to life. A book I've read more recently is Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto, and this is a book that is a novella and a short story, and I think I would describe this as like cozy lit fic, which I don't know if that's a real thing, but it definitely has very cozy vibes, despite the fact that it is about grief. And there is a relationship between 2 people, both of whom are experiencing grief throughout the novel and feeling detached from the world and outside of the world because of it, play a big part in the tone of the novel. I think that the writing was lovely, very simple but very charming at the same time. I watched the rows of windows in the tall building across the street from the bus stop, suspended, emitting a pretty blue light. The people moving behind those windows, the elevators going up and down, all of it sparkling silently, seemed to melt into the half darkness. It's very simple writing, but I think it is really bringing to life that kind of warm but melancholy tone, which is the thing that I really loved about this. The short story too deals with a relationship and love and loss, and has a slightly more magical tone to it, a slightly more magical element to it, but I think that they both play well together in the contents of one book. A very easy read and perfect for someone who wants a calm, reflective, cozy novel. It also has themes of food and kitchens, as you would expect by the title of it, kitchens and their relation to home and their relation to family, and the idea of building a family. I don't think it's a novel that's necessarily going to blow anyone's mind or be revolutionary for anyone, but it definitely has a lot of charm to it, and that is why I think it's a great book. One that is a little more discomforting, I think, was the winner of the Booker Prize a couple of years ago, The Promise by Damon, Galgut. I absolutely adored this novel, and I don't think I've recommended it enough on my channel. It is about a white South African family just outside Pretoria, and when the matriarch of this family dies, she makes the father swear that he will give the house on which their black servant lives to her as property. the time at which he dies, this is not possible in South Africa, but she makes him promise anyway. And we see over the years coming back to this family at different intervals, different moments of death and grief in the family, how these promises have been broken. There are 3 children of this family, and we follow each of them and their relationship with their family, their relationship with their whiteness in South Africa through the 1980s. And the moments of grief are also moments of political importance in South African history, whether that is the freedom of Nelson Mandela in the early 90s, or the discovery of fraud and corruption within the South African government in the 2000s and 10s, I think. So it covers through those history. And it is such a well-written novel. It is very dark and humorous at the same time, and also slightly strange in terms of the perspective. It travels. It's as if you are travelling around following this family, and it is in the third person, and then you get closer to the characters and it slips inside their mind and becomes the first person. But in that moment of slippage, in the moment between first and third, second person is used, and it talks to you the reader, you white South Africa. It is an uncomfortable and confronting novel with a lot of darkness but a lot of wit as well. There is a lightning strike moment that happens as well. Characters are very unlikable but very compelling at the same time, which I really love. I don't like unlikable boring characters. I like unlikable compelling characters, which this one definitely contains. It was one of those books that really pulled me in and hooked me, and I think the writing was absolutely masterful. Another book that has compelling, masterful writing is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is the second modern adaptation of a classic novel on this list as well. Demon Copperhead is Kingsolver's adaptation of David Copperfield, as you can tell by the title, transplanting David from 19th century London to late 20th century Appalachia. And we follow him, as we do in David Copperfield, from before his birth through his coming of age. It's a big chunky novel, but one that follows the beats of David Copperfield. And so if you know that novel, there can be a sense of stronger dramatic irony, but I think that knowing the beats of the novel, it doesn't ruin this, but also I don't think it is 100% necessary to enjoy the book either. This book is political. It's kind of a passionate howl against the injustices of the political and economic situation that has led to rural poverty in Appalachia. Its effects differently on different populations that live there, and whilst it follows the relentless darkness of his life, dealing with things like addiction and child labour and the effects of tobacco harvesting and the bad fostering and school system, the effects of football on someone, American football that is. At the same time, there is so much hope and love in this book, so many characters who are of that comic stock Dickens type, but I think more rounded and more fleshed out than they are in Dickens, but just as well observed. Outside of the stock comic characters, there are also complicated, difficult, well-drawn relationships full of love and heart, and people there in Appalachia not brought low by the difficult situations and circumstances in which they find themselves. The writing on a sentence to sentence level is absolutely gorgeous. It is one incredibly voicey book. Demon Copperhead tells you his story in the first person, and it mixes vernacular with poetry in a way that I think is really wonderful. He feels very much alive, and she uses the voice of Appalachia, from where she comes, to bring this story and this character to life. Another book that similarly uses vernacular and poetry to bring a world to life is Sing Unburied, Sing by Jessmyn Ward. This one is a ghost story set in the American South about a boy travelling with his mother and his little sister to pick up his father, who has just been released from prison. They live with his grandparents as well, and so the story of his grandfather is told alongside the story of this journey, and it is told from the perspective of Jojo, the son, but also from his mother Leonie, who is a drug addict herself. We follow her through trips and through withdrawal, and all the time the language that she uses is so poetic and beautiful. It reads like a prose poem, and the pain of her relationships, the pain of her experiences through life, of her and her brother, someone she loved so much, and her relationships with her mother. It's so beautiful and so heartbreaking. I don't cry very regularly at books, and Sing Unburied Sing is the only one on this list that made me cry. It's a rarity for me, but this one really touched me. As I said, there are ghosts, and this deals with the prison industrial complex. It deals with the history of prisons and their relationship to Jim Crow and slavery, and we see that most in the historical parts of the book that deal with Jojo's grandfather and his experience with the prison, and also police brutality. There is a moment on the page of their of an interaction with the police that was really difficult to read, but really wonderfully evoked. I think the language and the writing of Sing Unburied Sing is the reason that I love it the most, and I definitely need to read more Jessmyn Ward. Next on my list is one that I don't think that many people have read, and that is The Betrayed by Riene, Archache, Melvin, another ghost story set in the late 20th century, this time set in the Philippines at the end of the Marcos regime. It follows two sisters who are the daughters of a political agitator who was murdered in San Francisco, who have travelled back to the Philippines. One is pregnant and married to the godson of Marcos, who is working towards becoming a politician himself, and her sister, who is an artist and who is in love with the husband, although she cannot talk about it. The pregnant sister can also see ghosts, which is why this is a ghost story. The ghost of their father, but the ghosts of other people who have been killed by the political violence and the dictatorship in the Philippines. It follows them over the course of one summer, one sister travelling with the man as he campaigns for political position, travelling across the many islands of the Philippines to the more rural areas, seeing the ways that they interact with religion, both traditional religion and Christianity, a kind of the more occult sides of Catholicism that are brought out in these more rural areas, and also through Manila and the sticky darkness of a summer in Manila as well. There are a lot of kind of gross body things that happen in this book, and gross animal things. There is a lot of blood and gore, both in a more mystical way and in a very physical, political violence kind of way. And I think that the atmosphere of this is so very compelling. The writing is really sensual and very visceral and just so real. And she shows the way that politics and history repeat themselves, the way that the way that the past is not gone, but comes back again and again, as many coups are repeatedly attempted against the government, and a more strict crackdown is enacted because of that. Another little book I loved is The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is translated from the Korean by Zadie Smith. This one is about a woman who has many dreams about violence towards animals and decides to become a vegetarian, but this is seen as unacceptable, and the people in her life begin initially to try and stop her doing this. It is told from three different perspectives, that of her husband, her brother-in-law and her sister, and as our main character slowly loses touch with reality, the ways that the people in her life interact with her change as well. It begins with her husband, who is a truly awful character, and the ways he tries to force her to become more in line with society's expectations of her. And then it slips into her brother-in-law and his obsession with her. He is an artist, and the visualness of that section was really wonderfully beautiful, creepy and haunting, and it talks about sexual violence and sexual objectification in a way that felt really uncomfortable but also beautiful at the same time. And finally, as our character becomes more out of touch with reality, her sister, who cares for her, but her sister who also cares what the world will think of her. It is a book that gets darker and weirder and stranger as it goes on. It is a quiet novel, but I think really wonderfully written. Again, so visual and so present, and it feels very tangible, even though it becomes very strange as it goes on. I like that combination of strangeness and viscerality that I think is done really well in this book. Its explorations of societal expectations and of opting out, and how the world around her reacts to that. Always from outside of her mind, and I think the peering in and the watching of this person become a big part of the book. We are very much regarding her, and I think that is done so well as well. Very uncomfortable, but really wonderfully done. Another book that made me incredibly uncomfortable for slightly different reasons is The Discomfort of Evening by Mariana Rieneveld. This was translated from the Dutch, and it won the International Booker a few years ago. It follows a young girl who lives in a small religious community in the Netherlands, and her brother died in an ice skating accident, and we are seeing the way that she is dealing with grief and feeling very disconnected from the world around her, but also from herself. It is written almost in a disassociative state. It feels very blanked out in terms of the style of writing, very objective and disconnected and distanced and cold, but I think that really works well with the subject matter. There is a lot of violence in this novel, whether against animals or against people, and our main character is pushing against taboos and pushing against, again, what is acceptable for her. It is one of the only novels that really shocked me as well. Again, as I said earlier, I don't usually have like huge emotional reactions to books, but this book made me stop and like I was so shocked and so surprised and so uncomfortable that I had to take moments out of this book. And I think any book that has such a strong emotional reaction intentionally is definitely one that is worth reading. It looks at small communities and closed communities and the ways of pressure and the ways that your community can affect you. It is set in a rural community and there is an outbreak of foot and mouth disease leading to the slaughter of many cows. It is unflinching in that, unflinching in its reaction to every single point of human behaviour, and it deals with the madness of grief and pain, the violence against the body and the disgust with the body. And it's just a novel that is incredibly raw and impassive at the same time, and I really think it was very powerfully done. A kind of epic novel that I really loved was The Dead Wander in the Desert by Rollan Seisenbayev, which was translated from Kazakh, I believe. I don't think it was Russian, I think it was Kazakh. And this is, as I said, an epic novel that follows a huge cast of characters and reminds me a lot of traditional Russian novels, but is also told in the oral tradition of storytelling of a nomadic people. And it is about a huge lake that is known as the sea, the internal sea in Kazakhstan. It's a saltwater lake that has fed so many people and built up a whole community around it. But the Soviets have blocked up a river further up in order to irrigate fields in Uzbekistan, and this is causing the water of the lake to become more and more salty and the levels of the water to drop, and that's killing all of the fish. There are fish floating in the top of the river, and at the same time there are tests on nuclear bombs being done very nearby in the desert, as if people don't live there. And so there is issues of illness and deformities of children that are happening in this community as well, where there is no access to medical care. And so it is a story of governmental negligence and governmental abuse, and of a community trying to rally and trying to save itself against what feels like a desperate attempt, a desperate plea for help that is not necessarily noticed. Our main character is a lawyer and he travels to Moscow or St. Petersburg. He travels to the centre to try and fight for the cause of his people, and he cannot, and slowly more and more people leave the area. And it is a really powerful, moving novel that deals with travels over a large geographic area and follows so many different characters. It begins with people going on a camping trip near this lake, and they begin to tell the story of the lake. And so it is about stories and the way that we use stories to tell our history, to maintain our culture, and again, one that I just felt so emotionally resonant and wonderfully written, wonderfully translated as well. And another one that I don't think a huge amount of people have read, but I definitely think it's worth it. It's a Kazakh classic if you are looking to read some Kazakhstani fiction. And then the last one is an Icelandic book, a very little Icelandic book, and that is Summer Light and Then Comes the Night by Kallman Stefanson. This is a collection kind of short stories, although it is a novel about a place rather than a novel that follows a specific person. It follows this small town in Iceland, on the coast of Iceland, but like far away from Reykjavik. I can't remember if it's the north coast or like the west coast, but it's like far away. And it is about this small community, but it has a magical touch to it. There is a man who builds a giant house, who builds a house with giant holes in it in order to mimic the night sky. And it begins with these kind of whimsical tales at either end. It is bookended by these whimsical stories, and it gets darker and darker as it goes towards the centre, following the course of a year from Arctic summer to Arctic winter. And it follows again the idea of these small communities of people who watch one another, who are very aware of what's going on, judgmental tiny communities, people who leave, those to try and find freedom somewhere else, and people who return. And it deals a lot with like the stars and the night sky, and with the landscape, and with like the darker human emotions. Again, it has like disgusting, gross body stuff and sex stuff, very frank discussions of sex. And I think it was just so wonderfully written. It had that exact tone of like a darkly whimsical that I absolutely love, and don't find that often in books. books that are that make you feel uncomfortable because of their frankness, rather than a sort of performative disgustingness, which I find in a lot of the books where people talk about bodily disgust being a thing, it feels a lot more performative rather than frank. And I much prefer this version of it. It was a wonderfully weird little novel about living in a tiny community where sometimes it is dark 24 hours a day, and sometimes it is light forever as well. And I really, really enjoyed it. I think wonderful, wonderful book. And if you haven't read it, you should. Let me know in the comments down below if you can think of any novels that you think I will love because of this list. And if you have read any of them, I would love to hear your thoughts on them as well. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.